Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's daily devotional. For our daily devotional today, I want to focus on a term that we find here. We actually find it about 43 times in the New Testament. But the term that we want to look at this afternoon is the term affliction. And this is actually an interesting term because within the context, sometimes it can mean persecution, but then other times it can mean tribulation, trial. The term itself is literally pressure. That's what the term itself represents, is pressure or trouble. And it's translated as trouble in the New Testament. It's translated as burden in the New Testament, tribulation, as I mentioned, affliction. But in many of the cases, it's used side by side with persecution. So it's not necessarily always synonymous with persecution, suggesting that the concept of affliction carries with it more than just persecution from outside sources, from man and so forth. That this kind of entails all of the trials that I may face, which would include persecution, but also trials of life, times of misery, times of sorrow, times of depression, and so forth. And so I want to bring up a couple verses for us today to consider in considering this term, affliction. So Paul, as he's writing here in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, and he's reminding the brethren of everything that he had gone through and that the apostles and those teaching with Paul had gone through for the saints' sake, this is actually part of what Paul's going to build on to speak against those super apostles that he refers to later. So in verse 16 he says, "Therefore we do not lose heart. Even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day." Now, certainly within the immediate context, there is a sense of the idea of persecution here. But even beyond this, there's certainly, and we apply it on a regular basis to represent not just persecution, and certainly Paul's applying a principle to persecution. But the broader principle is that the fact is our outward man is perishing every day. Okay, every day is one day closer to death and one day closer to judgment. And so this principle that Paul applies here is certainly very broad. So then he says in verse 17, "For our light affliction, which is but for a moment," and of course that's obviously relative to the eternity that awaits in heaven, "is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. While we do not look at the things that are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things that are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal." Notice the contrast that Paul paints here with affliction and glory. Seen versus not seen. Earlier in verse 16, outward man perishing, inward man renewed. Verse 16, 17, and 18 all contain this contrast. And it's the contrast of the physical versus the spiritual. And the focus on and the perspective on what matters most. And even though in this life we have trouble, and we have trial, and we have sorrow, whether it's the root of that is from persecution or just issues of life, the fact of the matter is that's what life contains. Life contains affliction. And yet, we know that as we remain faithful through our affliction, it is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. In fact, Paul even says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, and in verse 3, in fact, this is the same term that Paul uses here in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 17. But he says, starting in verse 1, "Therefore, when we could no longer endure it, we thought it good to be left in Athens alone, and sent Timothy, our brother and minister of God, and our fellow laborer in the gospel of Christ, to establish you and encourage you concerning your faith. that no one should be shaken by these afflictions, for you yourselves know that we are appointed to this. For in fact, we told you before when we were with you that we would suffer tribulation, just as it happened, and you know. For this reason, when I could no longer endure it, I sent to know your faith, lest by some means the tempter had tempted you and our labor might be in vain. So notice, and again, it would seem to be that there's an immediate context of application of affliction to persecution. But again, that term affliction is a very broad term under which it's an umbrella term. Under this umbrella term, you've got persecution, you've got sorrow, you've got, again, that term is pressure. Anything that can cause us to feel pressured as Christians, things that might cause us to stumble or threaten to cause us to stumble. That's what Paul's describing here. And so when he says in verse 3 and 4, he says, you yourselves know that we are appointed to this. And I don't think he's talking about the we here is just him and those who are teaching the gospel. I think this is a very broad and open application Paul's making, that we as saints are appointed to affliction, that this is life, and this is part of the sorrow of wisdom, of having wisdom and understanding, is knowing that in this life, generally speaking, there's always going to be something on our plate. Okay, if our plate seems to be empty, it's not going to be empty for long, and we all know that. In fact, what tends to happen is we almost feel like our cup runneth over sometimes in terms of when things are going on and stressors are stressing us out. But Paul goes on to say here in verse 4, we told you before when we were with you that we would suffer tribulation just as it happened, and you know. So certainly Paul and those with him, they certainly had suffered tribulation, but this is something Paul acknowledges, and this is why he applies it directly to the brethren, that he sent Timothy to establish you and encourage you concerning your faith, that no one should be shaken by these afflictions. Okay, and certainly that's part of the afflictions that Paul and the apostles and the teachers of the gospel certainly don't be shaken by the afflictions that Paul and them are going through. But there's a much broader application of being shaken by the afflictions that you endure as well. We are appointed to this. Certainly those who teach the gospel are appointed to that, but all Christians, again, there's a broader principle at work here. And we saw that in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Now, this being the case, I want to go all the way back to the Old Testament for a minute. And I want to consider a passage in Genesis chapter 41 and see if we can't kind of bring together what we've learned from the New Testament and gain some insight into a term that is used in the Old Testament that is very, very similar in definition in the Hebrew to the term that we find in the New Testament for affliction. So starting in verse 50, to Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came. So earlier in Genesis chapter 41, Pharaoh had the dream, what ultimately Joseph was able to reveal as having 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. And so this is kind of the end of that dialogue, that narrative. So to Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh. And then he said, and then this is why. This is what the term Manasseh, specifically the term Manasseh, carries with it the idea of God has allowed me to forget. Okay, for God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. So all of the trouble that had visited Joseph and all of the care and all of course, we know Joseph's life and the roller coaster that was his life up to really Genesis chapter 41. So Manasseh, and of course, remember in the Old Testament, a lot of times these people were, the names that children were given generally had some sort of definition or reason for naming them that. So for Manasseh, it's God made me forget all my toil. But then we see in verse 52, the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. This term affliction in the Hebrew carries with it the sense, again, of misery, of depression, and kind of in a broader way, pressure. And considering all that Joseph had gone through, to name one of his sons Ephraim, which acknowledges the idea that God has allowed me to be blessed. God has blessed me, has allowed me to be fruitful in a land, in a place, in a environment that is constantly seeming to bring about misery and trial and hardship. And it's interesting because when we kind of compare the two, that you have this happening with Joseph, and Joseph names Ephraim this very thing, that God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. Isn't that the very thing that Paul just described in 2 Corinthians chapter 4? That we, despite our environment, which may cause us spiritual stress, which may cause us sorrow, the trials and tribulations that we face every day, despite this land in which we live, in a broad sense, the physical world, God has blessed us. He has blessed us physically, that's true, but in the broader scheme of the comparison of what Paul's describing there in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, it's despite the physical issues, we are blessed spiritually. And it is to that Paul speaks, that more about this eternal weight of glory. We look to the things that are not seen. The things that are not seen are eternal, he says. And so this idea of what Joseph named Ephraim, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction, in many ways, this is something that we can kind of associate with. We can kind of connect ourselves to this idea, because when we consider ourselves in this world, okay, God has caused us to be fruitful in a land of affliction, in a world of affliction, in a life of affliction. Certainly there is the physical fruitfulness that God gives us, and certainly that applies to the blessings, physical blessings we have. But even more than that, the very point that Paul makes, both to the Corinthians as well as to the Thessalonians, is that there are spiritual blessings to be had. Even though in this life we are appointed to affliction, in the next life we are appointed to glory. And it is that, and to that we look. And so I thought maybe we could just look at that and kind of appreciate the fact that certainly as the names Manasseh and Ephraim for Joseph kind of put to his mind, again, God has made me forget all my toil, all the trouble that he had faced. And then with Ephraim, despite all that trouble, God has made me fruitful. Certainly the names Manasseh and Ephraim carried special significance for Joseph, special appreciation, I guess you could say. And so certainly we need to have that same appreciation to God, that in a world that despite the physical blessings we have, ultimately this world is full of sorrow, it's full of hardship, and certainly there are the spiritual stumbling blocks that are thrown in our way by Satan every day. And when we look beyond this world, we look to the next world, we look to the home in heaven, and this is how we are renewed day by day. We look to God's word, we strengthen ourselves in the knowledge of his word and in our trust in him. And as we do so, we better appreciate the fact that whatever we go through, whatever affliction, this light affliction that is but for a moment, one day it'll all be worth it. All right, that's the daily devotional for you today. Remember, tomorrow we will have another daily devotional at 6:30. Thanks, everybody. Y'all have a great night.